Okay, welcome everyone to episode 31 of Headlines and History with me, your host, John Malik. So, what we're going to do, we're going to talk about Hezbollah today, or let's say what used to be Hezbollah. Given what's happened over the last few weeks, we've been talking about it a few times on the podcast, even put up an extra episode. Clearly, Hezbollah is reeling. I was even interviewed for Straight Arrow News, and we talked about it a little bit, about the position that Hezbollah is currently in. And so what I wanted to do was a history of Hezbollah, give a foundation of the organization, and what better time than now, where we can talk about what the organization is, what it is now, based on what Israel has done, where it started, and really why it's such an issue. Why it's such a problem, why Israel has decided to engage with Hezbollah in such a way that it's caused monster feedback, negative feedback, if you will, from across the world, really. And so let's talk the history of Hezbollah. So we're right in our wheelhouse today, headlines and history. We're talking about what's happening today. We're going to talk about the history of it. And we're right, like I said, we're right in the wheelhouse. We're right in the wheelhouse of the show here. So generally speaking, it is a Shia organization, a terror organization. It was, up until very recently, led by a man by the name of Hassan Nasrallah, who's Secretary General of this organization. It is based in Lebanon. It's based in Lebanon because of its history, which we'll get into. It is supplied and funded through Iran. It does other things as well, other criminal activities to gain monetary support, but it is generally and mainly funded by Iran. And it's made up of potentially 30, 40-ish thousand fighters, to include the leaders. Some estimates out there have Hezbollah at about 50,000. Comparatively, looking at the United States, the U.S., a division is about 15,000 people. Israel, a division's 10,000. So you're anywhere from 3 to 5 divisions of size compared to, depending on who you're comparing your organization to. And it has potentially about 150,000 rockets, mortars, missiles, all combined, with access to those munitions that it likes to shoot at Israel whenever it has the opportunity to do so. So it is not a small organization comparatively, meaning, certainly it's small when you're comparing it to militaries, but when you're talking about terror groups, you're talking about a rather large one. If you're to compare it to the Houthis, it's night and day. And the Houthis have some similar capabilities because Iran gives it to them, but the Houthis don't have 50,000 fighters and 150,000 missiles. They don't have that. And the other part about Hezbollah, other than being a terror group that makes it a bit interesting and a bit unique, is that it has a political role to play in Lebanon. And in fact, even though we talk about Hezbollah as a terror group, its origination comes from its the intent for terrorists and insurgents, fighters, whatever you want to call them, in Lebanon to create a political wing of their organization. It was called the Islamic Resistance of Lebanon. They were military focused only, and they felt like they could make more headway if they could take advantage of the resources that Lebanon could provide in its actual government structure. And so they created a political entity, Hezbollah, which again ended up morphing into this all-encompassing political terror entity. So, and over the last few weeks, in particular, as we talked about on the Israel Pager operation, the IDF has been targeting Hezbollah very, very heavily since it's come to a near conclusion or almost culmination of its operations in Gaza against Hamas. And Israel's decided, the leadership in Israel rather, Prime Minister Netanyahu has decided that now's the time. Now's the time after October 7th that they're going to put together their resources. They were going to generate operations and we're going to go after Hamas. And if they're going to do that, then they're also going to do Hezbollah. And they're also going to do the Houthis, and they're going to target some of the Shia militia groups in Iraq. They're going to do all of them. And it looks as if they're really on step 2, if you will. And I think they're probably two major efforts, let's say. I think really they want to focus on Hamas in Gaza, and they want to focus on Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Houthis are going to be, an ancillary target. The Shia militia groups are going to be ancillary targets as well. They'll target them when need be, but I think their two main priorities are going to be Hezbollah and Hamas, as we've seen already. So let's take a step back. So that's where we stand today, right? Hezbollah is reeling off of what the IDF has done. But where did they come from? Why are they even there? And why is Israel even dealing with them? Well, as we know, the Middle East in and of itself is a complicated region. I mean, many regions in the world are, but the Middle East is no different, let's say. And we have to understand the history of Lebanon a little bit if we're going to understand the history of Hezbollah. So we have to go. We should even really go further back than that and discuss what the why Iran has this connection and why we're talking Shia Sunni. So as we know, right, the Prophet Muhammad ended up dying. He lived from 570 to 632. He died in the early 600s, and then Islam spread rather rapidly by the sword, generally. So there's a split in Islam between what are known as the Shia and the Sunni, and the Shia are described as partisans of Ali, and basically what they believe is that there should be a direct political and religious lineage from Ali, the fourth caliph, down through all of the leadership into today. And so there needs to be a direct connection, a direct bloodline lineage to Muhammad. And if you do not have that, then you aren't an authentic leader of the religion. And Sunnis believe the opposite, believe there's no need to be directly related to Muhammad, that you just need to be a member of the group, and that you need to be a scholar, you need to be well learned, and then you could pass on your understanding and your teachings to others, and that qualifies you enough, if you will, to be a Muslim, to be a good Muslim. And you don't have to be, again, this direct lineage. And so you might imagine from a historical perspective that there's a lot more Sunnis than there are Shia in the world, and you'd be right to make that guess. It seems as if that the belief in a Sunni way of life would be, or a Sunni religious understanding would be, a little bit more welcoming. You don't have to be a direct descendant of Ali and therefore Muhammad, but nonetheless, so there's a split, and then there are, the vast majority of Muslims today are Sunni, but there are a large percentage in and around Iran, Iraq, some in Turkey, and they make up about 10 to 15%. So it really is the majority Sunni. But nonetheless, so in history, you have the Persian Empire, comes about in Iran, and then eventually there's a Safavid Empire that comes about in the 1500s, and the Safavids who come to power in Iran end up forcibly converting all of the people who live within the Persian Empire area of where we would look at Iran today, and then convert them to Shiism. So again, Shias believing you have to have a direct lineage. So there's this centralization, if you will, of most of the Shias that live in the world come from this transition to the Safavid Empire, or when the Safavid Empire takes over, and there's some Shia belief in southern Iraq, and then mainly Iran, and then in that area. But most of the rest of the world, the Ottomans, Antioch, those places, Turkey, that's Sunni, and Saudi Arabia, and that's Sunni as well. And there's this connection between Iran and Lebanon because there's a subset of Shiism called the Druze people, and they believe in, again, this subset of Shiism. It's under the greater umbrella of Shia belief, but nonetheless, they end up finding themselves in the area of Lebanon centuries and centuries ago, but they hold that Shia belief, and so there's this religious connection in Lebanon to the vast majority of Shias who are living in Iran. The other thing that makes Lebanon a little interesting, other than the fact they have the Druze, this subset of Shiism, they have Maronite Christians as well, who have found themselves under the Ottoman Empire eventually, and then in Lebanon, who are again a subset of Christianity. They have a tie to Catholicism. They have a tie in the sense that they believe that Peter was the leader of the one true church, if you will, and then every pope that followed Peter is, again, a lineage chosen by God. This is not a physical lineage. It's not born of, but chosen by God through the Catholic way of voting. All right, it's the most simplistic way I can explain it. But nonetheless, that all the popes are descended from Peter religiously. And again, the Maronites believe that, but they believe, again, a specific version of Catholicism that was practiced by Saint Maron. And so the Maronite Christians are a Syriac ethno-religious group in the same way that the Jewish people are. So if you find somebody who's Jewish, you can, let's say they are from Israel and they've lived in Israel forever, forever, quote, forever, but that they will be ethnically Jewish as well as religiously Jewish, right? You could have somebody who's ethnically Jewish but converts to Christianity and they're a Christian, but they're ethnically Jewish. Same thing with the Maronites in Lebanon. This Saint Maran character he was a heretic Syriac. He was, was kind of like a monk-like figure, if you will, very, very quiet, and spent most of his life just in deep religious study. Devout follower of the Pope. And a lot of his followers, who originated in Antioch, so up in Turkey, eventually made it to Lebanon. So in Lebanon today, we have this Shia connection from Iran, and we have this Maronite Christian connection from Turkey, both settling down in the area of Lebanon. And this ethnic/religious makeup in Lebanon is actually what led to the current constitution that is there today, where the parliament is broken up by religious sections, right? So they wanted to ensure, the political leadership at the time when the most recent constitution was written, wanted to ensure everyone who lived there, even though they had very different beliefs, would be represented accordingly in parliament. And so there is a percentage of Christians who hold seats in parliament and a percentage of Shia Muslims. The Maronites hold some. And it's all broken out so everyone gets the representation that they deserve. It may not be a version of democracy that we understand, right? In the United States, for example, you're voted in just based on your capabilities, and it has nothing to do with your race or your religion. But Lebanon chose a different path and decided, in order to ensure that all minorities had a role at the table, they wouldn't be able to be voted out, in a sense, and they wouldn't be held without any representation. So of the total seats, and let me look here to make sure, 128 they have in parliament today, 64 are given to the Christians and 64 are given to the Muslims and the Druze. So you have, again, that total of 128. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but currently, since 2022, Hezbollah itself holds 13 seats. So 13 of those 64 that go to Muslims and Druze, Hezbollah has control of. So that's where the groups of people that live in Lebanon came from, if you will. If we're going to go back many, many centuries. But the political divisions in Lebanon, meaning where the country's borders are drawn today, this goes back to World War I, as I know that we've talked about on the show a couple of different times. This goes back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the fact that the Ottoman Empire chose the wrong side in World War I, and the British and the French decided to partition the vast majority of the Middle East into different spheres of influence. Some of them became mandates, and Lebanon fell within the Syrian mandate, which fell under French control, as it was decided again in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So the British had more influence in Iraq and the French over in Syria and Lebanon. The current borders, specifically the ones that we see on the map today, were drawn in 1920. So the current borders of Lebanon, the ones that we see today, were drawn in 1920. So just 1 year, 2 years. So just 2 years after the end of World War I. In 1923, so the borders are drawn for Lebanon in 20 and 23, a greater Syria is formed, and there are like countries within the mandate, if you will. And so there's 6 main administrative regions within greater Syria by 23. And they are called Damascus, Aleppo, El Oeves, Jamal Juiz, Sanjay of Alexandretta, and then the state of Greater Lebanon, which you might imagine became the Lebanon of today. And Lebanon then, as it is now, was filled mainly with Maronite Christians. And interestingly, because they were a minority, even though they had, the most of the Maronites live in Lebanon, they're still a minority. They felt like the French mandate may end up leading them in some way to independence, that they would have their own country. They wouldn't have to share with anyone else. And so, interestingly, they ended up supporting the French mandate, where most of the Arabs that lived in the Middle East after World War I did not support the mandate, right? They wanted independence. That's the whole story of Lawrence of Arabia and promises of freedom and independence, hence why they supported Lawrence against the Ottomans in the Hejaz down in Saudi Arabia. But anyways, so the independence never came, but interestingly, the Maronites decided to support the French. They were one of the few. The others, as you might imagine, put up some resistance. Anyway, these administrative regions are eventually dissolved, and Syria becomes the country that you see today, and which was separated from Lebanon, right? Don't want to get too deep into that history. And that's the way that it's been since World War I, okay? Skipping forward, let's get into the more recent times, post-World War II, where we can really start talking about the formulation of Hezbollah. So post-World War II, we have 1948, Israel declares independence. Now, this is where a lot of the consternation starts, right? You have the story of the Jewish diaspora spending centuries, millennia away from the homeland in Palestine. And 1948, the end of the war, they declare independence, even though it's not agreed upon. They do it on their own. Whole long story, but anyways, they become an independent country in 48, and this is where we get this beginning of the problems between Israel and Palestine. Clearly, you have the Nakba, which is the forced removal of Palestinians from their homes who have been living in the area of Israel for years and years and years and years and years, and now they feel like they're in the diaspora, and we have this challenge, right? And so this becomes where a lot of the unrest starts, obviously, between the foundation and the formulation of Israel and its Arab partners. Now, I say it might seem obvious that in 48 is where the problems begin, but I mean that quite literally, because the day after Israel declared independence in 48, it was attacked by five separate countries, one of which was Lebanon. And so it wasn't like Israel found itself a new country in 48, and then a couple of decades later, people started to get upset and things turned sideways. No, it's literally been since the day after. And I'm not here to talk on this episode about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing or right or wrong or whether they belong there or they don't. That's not for today's episode. I'm simply speaking factually. It was a UN recognized establishment since 48, and they were attacked the day after. Right. So since then, Israel, which really gives an understanding of how Israel operates today, since the day after it formed, it's been defending itself. So you may remember, shortly after 48, an organization called the Palestinian Liberation Organization forms, and their purpose is really in their title, and that is to liberate the Palestinians who they felt have been pushed out because of the creation of Israel, eventually led by a very famous leader, Yasser Arafat. He wasn't the first, but he's one of the most famous. And so the PLO, in the beginning, the PLO was really the first and most capable entity pushing back against Israel and the IDF, and really trying to cause damage in Tel Aviv in order to try to return the Palestinians to their original homeland as they see it, or potentially even a two-state solution. That never happened, but at least the PLO had claimed that was something that would be on the table. Eventually, in 1975, we have a civil war in Lebanon. The civil war eventually ends in 1990, but it's perpetrated. The reason that it exists is that these multiple different ethno-religious groups within Lebanon end up fighting, and it's the PLO is heavily involved, and they're fighting against the Christians. The Druze are involved, Shia Muslims, or even some Sunnis involved, and so there's this big kerfuffle, right? Civil war. Now, while this is happening, though, remember I said it doesn't end until 1990. In 1978, the PLO takes advantage. The PLO and others, Fatah, which is another Palestinian organization, quasi-terror organization, that they start taking advantage of the chaos, and they start attacking Israel in about 1978. So they're doing it before then, but it really becomes big 1978. And they're attacking in northern Israel, right? Part of the problem is they think that the Israelis are conducting settlement operations, if you will. More Jews are taking land from Palestinians that were promised to them under the 47 borders post-World War II with the UN. And nonetheless, so they're attacking into northern Israel, which, by the way, is happening right now, literally today as I'm recording, same thing. And Israel decides at a certain point in 78, they're going to conduct an operation into southern Lebanon, Operation Litani, and they're going to attack the PLO into southern Lebanon. They want to push these PLO militants back out of the firing zone, the indirect fire areas where they can shoot their rockets into northern Israel, back up against the Litani River, which is about 30-ish clicks, 35 kilometers north of the border between Israel and Lebanon. The operation began, generally speaking, because of the pushback and to create this buffer zone, but the trigger, the catalyst, was something called the Coastal Road Massacre. And this happened on March 11th in 78. Palestinian militants tied to the PLO seized a bus that was driving along the Coastal River Road on the west side of Israel. This was just near Tel Aviv. They ended up murdering 38 civilians, 13 of which were children. The operation was conducted by Fatah, that other Palestinian organization I had mentioned earlier. Yasser Arafat was also involved. Interestingly enough, in this tit-for-tat-like environment, this operation to seize the bus was in response to something that happened in 73, which was the martyrdom, in their language, of Kamal Adwan, who was killed in a raid by the IDF. Initially, the plan for the Coastal Road Massacre was supposed to be an exchange of hostages. So they were going to seize the bus, they were going to take the bus somewhere, and then they were going to negotiate. It ended up going sideways, and all of these civilians died on the bus. Hostages were even shot as the bus eventually stops, and hostages got out to run away, and the Palestinians shot them in the back as they were running away, and it was brutal. So nonetheless, this is the impetus for, okay, Israel says, okay, now we're going into southern Lebanon, Operation Litani. Tactically, it was a success. Israel pushes back into southern Lebanon, and many of the PLO fighters, the Palestinian militant fighters, are pushed back up towards the Litani River. You might ask yourself, why is the PLO even in Lebanon in the first place? How did they get there? Well, they're originally from Jordan. And during the Jordanian Civil War, the PLO was actually ended up kicked out of Jordan during something called Black September, when the PLO was fighting against King Hussein and his forces, and they ended up finding themselves some place to land in Lebanon. Nonetheless, at the end of this operation, we eventually have something called UNIFIL, which is the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, in order to try and keep the peace. That organization is still there. Then we have the next year. So Operation Litani is in 78. Then we have probably the most critical year in recent memory in all of the Middle East, and that's 79, the next year, when there's the revolution in Iran, when the Ayatollah Khomeini ends up taking charge, right? The revolution happens, the Islamic Revolution. The Shah is in the United States. He's the one that we supported after removing Mossadegh in 53, and no one likes the Shah. Well, that's not true. Many don't like the Shah in Iran. He's a brutal guy. But nonetheless, he was amenable to the United States, and so we supported him. Again, eventually he finds his way into the United States for cancer treatment, and the revolution occurs. This is when we had the hostages held for 444 days in Iran, and then eventually the Ayatollah seizes control, builds the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which is in control, which is the main security force in all of Iran today. Well, again, Iran is Shia, and so you go from a quasi-secular country in the 50s and 60s and 70s into now a very religious, non-secular state into the 80s after 79, and then Iran finds itself politically and religiously trying to export its version of Sharia and the Shia Islamic way of life, and it wants to push this idea, not just in Iran after it seizes control in Tehran, but it wants to push this as far as it can go. And so it begins to make connections with other Shia majorities. Again, they're the vast minority across the Middle East, but Shia majorities, pockets that they can find them. One of them is in Lebanon. It begins its outreach in 79, but eventually has to pull back in 80 because it ends up fighting its own war, the Iran-Iraq war between 80 and 88 against Saddam Hussein. So the reason I bring this up is to say that the connections were made when the new regime came into Tehran in 79. They already made some connections with Lebanese Shia, but it would have probably went much further. Relationships would have been much stronger had it not been for the Iran-Iraq war, where Iran had to turn back in and then face and deal with Saddam. So would it have made any difference today? Meaning, like, would they, I don't know. I don't know if the relationships would have been even more stronger today if that had happened, but definitely it didn't happen as quickly. The export of Shiism didn't happen as quickly as the Ayatollah would have liked, because, again, he had to deal with Saddam. Now, even though the operation in 78, Operation Litani, was tactically successful, as I had mentioned, in 1982, Israel decides to go back into Lebanon because there had been skirmishes along the border. There wasn't the complete eradication of these PLO fighters. And Palestinian militants, again, PLO, Fatah, they weren't completely eradicated. So there had still been these, again, skirmishes across the border. Civilians on both sides died. Military soldiers had died on both sides as well. And so Israel decided, okay, we're going back in like we did in 78. We're doing it in 82. The difference this time, though, is that the defense minister is Ariel Sharon, who eventually became the prime minister later in decades later. But Sharon had a different vision. He really wanted to make it all the way to Beirut. He felt like, although tactically getting to Litani in 78 was successful, they needed, in order to be even more fully successful, to take a bigger chunk out of the supply lines and a bigger, to do much more damage to the militants, they needed to go to Beirut, where a lot of the leadership used to be. Now, just like there was an incident in 78, that was the triggering event, and that's the Coastal Road Massacre, there was a triggering event in 82, and that was the assassination attempt on the Israeli ambassador to the UK. And then Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and I said the defense minister was Ariel Sharon, they used that incident as a way to gather public support for going back in 82. Now, there's a technicality built in here. There was a ceasefire after the 78 timeframe that was supposed to be in place here in 82, and the Israelis had said that the militants in Lebanon weren't abiding by the ceasefire. It gets really complicated in this point, but just know that Israel decides to go back in anyways, okay, regardless of the legal or technicalities that were involved. And it was the support from the Israeli citizenry was similar then as it is today, and that is they were so upset about the Coastal Road Massacre and then this attempted assassination that they were kind of all in. And the leadership, the more aggressive conservative leadership at the time, Begin and Sharon, were taking advantage of that political climate, right, or environment, and choosing to go as far as they could, right? Hence the decision to go even further than the Litani again and go into Beirut. Very similar to what's happening today. Prime Minister Netanyahu is taking advantage of what happened on October 7th to deal with Hamas and Hezbollah in ways that he hasn't in the recent past. Beirut was hit pretty hard. Pretty hard. The news was able to show how brutal the fighting was, and Israel did not come out looking all that great. A lot of civilians died. There was a lot of damage, and it wasn't a positive story in that way for Israel. Some were even arguing that Israel wanted to install like a Christian government up in Beirut at the time, so there was a lot of misinformation going on. Does it sound familiar? Happening again today. Now, here's one of those events that we talk about in history where sometimes luck just gets involved. Something that's not necessarily planned, nobody really is in control of, but it just happens to be happening, and it ends up becoming part of the story. And that's exactly what happened here. So in the second invasion in 82, it just so happened, disconnected from the invasion, there were a bunch of Lebanese Shia that had traveled to Iran, mainly clerics. And while they were in Iran, they decided, hey, we've already got this religious relationship. We've been friends since, way back when there was, majority Shia in Iran and then Shia in Lebanon. And then we made some headway and some official relationships, if you will, in 79 when the revolution came in. Now it's 82. Let's really take a step forward. Hey, we could use some help. When I say we, I mean the Lebanese Shia clerics. They're like, listen, could you see what's happening over here? Israel is invading again. We really could use some help. At first, Iran is a little uneasy. It's 82. We're only 2 years into the war with Saddam Hussein. This is a brutal back and forth. Nobody's making a lot of headway. And and Iran already knows that Israel is a pretty formidable force. They've grown pretty strong since 48. They saw what they did in Lebanon in 78. So Iran is a bit hesitant. It's only 2.5 years old at this point, in its current form. The Lebanese Shia clerics have a very, very close relationship to the ambassador, Iran's ambassador to Syria. They tug on those strings a little bit, and the ambassador is able to convince the leadership, to include the Ayatollah, that this is a good thing, and Iran really needs to support the Lebanese Shia, the Palestinian militants, against Israel. The Ayatollah says yes, sends in specially trained IRGC, so Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps members, well-trained, well-funded fighters back into Lebanon to teach them how to better fight against Israel. A militant group eventually forms out of this, the Islamic Resistance in Lebanon. They take in these IRGC fighters and they fight against Israel. They defend against Israel. But the IRL knows, as I had mentioned at the outset of the conversation, the IRL wants a little bit more power, wants a little more capability. They don't want to be just this raw militant group. They need a political arm. They need the ability to tap into the Lebanese government so they can take assets and resources and have control over decisions that are made in Beirut to make them more capable against Israel. So they do that, and they formulate the party of God, Hezbollah. This is 1982. So now Hezbollah, this new political arm of the IRL, they come out at the outset. They have 3 initial objectives, right? You'd ask yourself, okay, what is it that they actually are here for? Yeah, you need a political arm, but what are they looking to do? So they have 3 objectives. The first, to explain to the Lebanese people what they're doing. Right? They put out a big campaign of this is why we're here. They're there to recruit fighters. Clearly, they need as many of those as they can get. And they want to help those that have been hurt as a result of the Israeli invasion. And that's where they make their money, if you will. That's where their bread is buttered, in devising a plan to reach out to those, not just to fight back, but to reach out to those who needed help, those who had lost their homes or those who were hungry or whatever. Hezbollah would reach out to them and say, hey, we're not only here to defend you, but I'm here to help. And many of the poor Shia who had lived in Lebanon at the time didn't feel that they got that from the current political structure. And they found that in Hezbollah. And so when it was founded and it started to take money from the Iranian regime, who I said decided to support the fight against Israel, they not only took the money to buy weapons, they not only took the money to fund training, but they built schools and hospitals and provided security, food, water for people that had lived in Lebanon who they felt they needed to protect. And again, this created a groundswell of support. The Shias who lived in Lebanon now felt they really had somebody who cared about them. And now we have not only an event like, the support from Iran and the money coming in, building schools and providing security, providing food, but you have an emotional event which helps to draw in more support for Hezbollah. But interestingly, it's not because of anything Israel did, really. It's about what the Christians did during the Civil War. Remember, the Lebanese Civil War started in 75 and didn't end until 90. It's still going on. Right? In the midst of all of this, Operation Litani and then that 82 and the revolution, this is still, the back and forth between all of these different groups in Lebanon is still going on. So what happens is There's a Christian militant group that's involved in the Civil War. They get access to an old French barracks, right? Old French barracks. We're talking World War I time frame, right? When the French mandate was still around. And they turned it into a prison. And it was called the Cayenne prison. Again, chuckle at my pronunciations. They're awful. And again, it was used during the Civil War that began in 1975. And it turns out that the Israelis ended up using this prison as well. When they were involved in fighting against the Shia militants in southern Lebanon, they got access to this prison, even though it was controlled by the southern Lebanon army. And rumors started to filter out that the Israelis were torturing people in the prison. Robert Fisk is a very famous journalist, and he was there to describe some of the things the Israelis were participating in. And I'm going to read it to you verbatim. There was the whipping pole and the window grills where prisoners were tied naked for days, freezing water thrown over them at night. Then there were the electric leads for the little dynamo, the machine mercifully taken off to Israel by the interrogators, which had the inmates shrieking with pain when the electrodes touched their fingers and penises. And there were the handcuffs which an ex-prisoner handed to me yesterday afternoon. They were used over years to bind the arms of prisoners before interrogation, and they wore them day and night as they were kicked so badly in Suleiman Ramadan's case that they later had to amputate his arm. Another prisoner was so badly beaten he lost the use of his leg. I found his crutch in Cayenne prison yesterday, along with piles of Red Cross letters from prisoners, letters which the guards from Israel's now defunct southern Lebanon army militia never bothered to forward. Over 15 years, 11 people were believed to have died over that time. And this is that emotional event that I talked about. And it becomes an issue very similar to the Abu Ghraib problem for the Americans in Iraq after the invasion in 2003. It's not necessarily reflective of the overall military. Abu Ghraib was not clearly part of the process that the American military was involved in. We don't torture people. But this unit got out of hand, poor leadership. They were all found guilty, all of those things, but it's the perception. And I remember being in Iraq in 2005 and reading a lot of intelligence reports that came in. I mean, there's obviously a lot of them, but in a lot of the human reports, individuals had said, I'm fighting. I wasn't fighting in 2003, wasn't fighting in 2004 necessarily, but in 2005, this whole Abu Ghraib thing, I'm in it. I don't care what Saddam was involved in. I don't even care what Al-Qaeda in Iraq is involved in. Zarqawi's kind of crazy. But listen, you can't take Muslims and put them into a prison and just torture them. And there's pictures in the whole night. So Abu Ghraib became this strategic event that ended up damaging the counterinsurgency in Iraq drastically and ended up damaging permanently a lot of people's vision of the United States. It was disastrous. And the same was true for Cayenne prison in Lebanon. At this point, we're still in 82, that the PLO is kind of phased out. It's kind of getting pushed out, and Hezbollah becomes more important. Hezbollah starts to fill the role in Lebanon for defending the Shias. And they get started with some pretty high-profile events. On July 19th, 1982, Davis Dodge, the president of American University, he was kidnapped, eventually held in Tehran for over a year. November 11th, 1982, there's a suicide bomb that detonated in Tyre against an IDF headquarters. 75 Israelis were killed. Israel didn't actually admit that it was conducted, that there was a headquarters there, and Israelis died until 2024, nonetheless. And then 1983 gets even busier. If you remember, April 18th, a suicide truck bombed the U.S. Embassy in Beirut. 49 people were killed, 34 injured. And then the major event that most of us recall, October 23rd, the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, 299 killed, 240 of which were U.S. Marines. These are all actions taken by Hezbollah, supported by Iran, in 1982 and 1983 that put Hezbollah on the map. 1985, Hezbollah decides, okay, we're gonna come out here and we're gonna give you our breakdown. We're gonna give you a statement of our goals. and we're going to tell you why we exist other than what you think is the obvious, and we're going to break it down. Here's what they say, quote, "Let us put it truthfully. The sons of Hezbollah know who are their major enemies in the Middle East: the Phalanges, Israel, France, and the U.S. The sons of our Ummah are now in a state of growing confrontation with them and will remain so until the realization of the following three objectives. 1, to expel the Americans, the French, and their allies definitely from Lebanon, putting an end to any colonialist entity on our land. 2, to submit the Phalanges to a just power and bring them all to justice for the crimes they have perpetrated against Muslims and Christians. To permit all the sons of our people to determine their future and to choose in all the liberty the form of government they desire. We call upon all of them to pick the option of Islamic government which, alone, is capable of guaranteeing justice and liberty for all. Only an Islamic regime can stop any further tentative attempts of imperialistic infiltration into our country." Now, Phalanges, let me go back really quick. It's like a certain sect of Christians that are in Lebanon, okay? Now, this is what Hezbollah has to say about Israel. "We see in Israel the vanguard of the United States in our Islamic world. It is the hated enemy that must be fought until the hated ones get what they deserve. The enemy is the greatest danger to our future generations and to the destiny of our lands, particularly as it glorifies the ideas of settlement and expansion, initiated in Palestine and yearning outward to the extension of the great Israel, from the Euphrates to the Nile. Our primary assumption is our fight against Israel states that the Zionist entity is aggressive from its inception and built on lands wrested from their owners at the expense of the rights of the Muslim people. Therefore, our struggle will end only when this entity is obliterated. We recognize no treaty with it, no ceasefire, and no peace agreements, whether separate or consolidated. We vigorously condemn all plans for negotiation with Israel and regard all negotiators as enemies, for the reason that such negotiation is nothing but the recognition of the legitimacy of the Zionist occupation of Lebanon." End quote there. Now, what's interesting here is that, there's been talk recently that potentially Hezbollah was going to negotiate and get into or agree to a ceasefire recently with Prime Minister Netanyahu before the assassination and the killing of Hassan Nasrallah. Something tells me that wasn't the case. You just have to look at their bylaws, right? Nonetheless, so this is who Hezbollah is, and this is what they mean. This is why they exist. 1990, then, this comes, the Lebanese civil war ends. All sectarian groups by UN mandate are ordered to disarm. Hezbollah, by the way, too big, too powerful to care. Clearly, they don't comply. And also, this is the same year that Hezbollah began training Hamas fighters for their liberation, again, in their words, in Gaza. 92 comes, they choose their new leader, Hassan Nasrallah. So for the beginning, from 82 to 92, Nasrallah is not the Secretary General. It's another individual. But Nasrallah, who becomes the most famous and longest serving, again, takes charge in 92. Nasrallah was a bit different, though, in when compared to his previous leader. The previous leader was focused on all of the Hezbollah objectives equally, let's say. I mean, clearly they didn't want the Israelis in Lebanon, but they wanted to take as much control in Beirut as they could, so they were operating against the Christians. They were focused on, support from Iran, blah, blah, blah. Hassan Nasrallah reprioritized things and decided that Israel, and Israel alone, was really the main concern. Now, other issues were still around, but Israel became his raison d'etre, right? That then became Hezbollah's main goal. Nasrallah himself, he was born in a poor area of Beirut, 1960. He studied Shiism, as you might imagine. He studied in Iraq and Iran before joining Hezbollah in the 80s as just a member. He went to Iraq in 76, and he studied under Muqtada al-Sadar's father, who started the Dawa Party. He was booted from Iraq in 79, just like the Ayatollah was. He joined Hezbollah in 82, as I had said, when it formed. And then he ended up going for more Shia training in Qom, Iran, in 89. comes back, takes control of Hezbollah in 92, and he's placed into power rather abruptly when his predecessor, as I had mentioned, he was killed in an Israeli helicopter strike. Israel attacked into Lebanon again in 93, so another attack north, but this time Hezbollah was a little bit more powerful, and it really put some of the Israelis on their heels. Some of the citizens were a bit nervous because Hezbollah kind of held their own. They weren't walked over in like they were in 78 and 82, and they put up a fight. And this demonstrated the capacity, the capability of Iran to fund and train Hezbollah, and it did a pretty good job over the last 15-ish years. Israel decides eventually, in just a few years later in 2000, to pull out of Lebanon. And this is when the myth of Hezbollah really blows up, really becomes a big deal. The myth being that Hezbollah, and they perpetrated this themselves in a lot of ways, but they pushed Israel out of Lebanon in 2000. Not that Israel left on their own, but having fought much more capably in 93, and then just a few years later, Israel pulls out. Hezbollah's like, I told you so, we can hold our own. Now, Hezbollah is not beloved, though, with everybody in Lebanon, as you might imagine. As we had said, there are, many different ethnic and religious groups that are in Lebanon, and there are, standard seats in parliament to ensure everyone is taken care of. And Beirut was at one point called the Paris of the Middle East. I mean, it was very secular. You could see the same pictures in Kabul and in Tehran before some of these religious revolutions. But anyways, so there is a cosmopolitanism in Beirut. And, the way of life that Hezbollah portrays isn't something that everybody agrees with. They started making the hijab mandatory to be worn. They took over the bars a lot of times. They smashed alcohol bottles because it didn't fit within the Sharia law, the Sharia understanding, rather. It expands. They don't go away. They get bigger and more powerful. And again, they started to even more further use the political apparatus to gain more money and control over what happened in Lebanon as a whole. It had enough power in parliament to have what they call a blocking third, which means, and this is something Matt Levitt had described in an NPR interview that I'll link to in the show, that they had a blocking third, which meant that they had enough seats in parliament, as I had said, they had become part of the political process, that they could ensure that other groups couldn't pass certain laws. And in this interview in NPR, Matt described Hezbollah as being a part of and apart from the Lebanese government at the same time. And they operate really kind of like an organized crime group does. They, through fear, intimidation, money from Iran, they help the Shia people, but at the same time, they ensure that what they want to get done in parliament gets done. So they lose some standing. They lose some popular standing, if you will, with some of these injunctions and some of these laws they put in place in Beirut. And then jumping forward, they have another whole incident where they lose a bunch of respect, and this happens to be related with Syria. So what happens is, in the Arab Spring, if you recall, in 2011, begins in Tunisia and spreads to Syria. Now, Assad ends up cracking down pretty heavily on those that are uprising in Syria, right? Ends up leading to the Syrian civil war, which is still ongoing. And it threatens the regime. So Iran steps in at the behest of Assad, who's Shia, even though the vast majority of his population in Syria is Sunni. Iran steps in, and they send the IRGC and Hezbollah fighters, right, who've been being trained now for a very long time by the IRGC, to help the regime stand up. This changes things, because no longer is Hezbollah now just looked as the entity that protects Lebanon against Israel, against the United States, and keeps Lebanon strong. They're now part of this greater security organization who not only fights Christians and Jews, but now they're fighting other Muslims. And there's, we talk about the separation between Sunni and Shia, and, it's real, but it doesn't mean that everyone hates each other to a certain extent. They're all still Muslims at the end of the day. It's a very, very small population of the ISIS and Al-Qaeda who believe that killing other Shias is right. As a matter of fact, it's one of the splits that came between Zarqawi and bin Laden, after Zarqawi wanted to stoke sectarian violence in Iraq, and he felt like it was the duty of Sunnis to kill Shia because they were apostates. Most people don't think that way in the Islamic community. So when Hezbollah was involved in killing Sunni Muslims who were rising up against Assad, Hezbollah lost a lot of respect across the region. Now, it doesn't mean they lost a lot of power. They're still being supported by Iran, right? Up until the last couple of weeks, obviously. But they ended up becoming a bit more isolated, if you will, and are looked upon now more so as really just a terror element that's looking to fight anybody that rejects their way of life, particularly the Iranian regime's religious viewpoints and their way of life, more than being this freedom-loving Islamic supporter against the Jews in Lebanon and part of a political process, which a lot of people could kind of get behind, but they're not really behind the new Hezbollah. But, I mean, what's Hezbollah going to do? They get all of their money and training from Iran. They got to, you got to kiss the ring, if you will. So those are some of the events that brought us to where we are today in terms of Hezbollah's history and why they formed in 82 and why they're fighting today. So through all these years, most recent years, they've continued to fight against Israel, expansion of Israel that they believe are the settler expansion in the north. And they've been able to gather tens of thousands of fighters and 150,000-ish rockets, like I had explained in the beginning. And they're constantly harassing and constantly going after Israel, particularly in the north, which before October 7th, and it's been going on for a while, the Israelis have 60, 70, 80,000 internally displaced persons who can't live in northern Israel anymore because Hezbollah is constantly shooting at them. And so October 7th occurs, as we've talked about. Netanyahu goes into Gaza, and again, he says to himself, listen, I think I'm in a point where I can get some support here. I'm going after Hezbollah too. And what ends up happening in the last 2 weeks, I'm recording here on October 5th, is Israel's now demonstrated the most advanced, most capable, most effective counter-terror operation in recent memory, if not in the last couple of centuries. It could even be the entire human existence. I mean, they have eviscerated the senior Hezbollah leadership. They killed Hassan Nasrallah the other day, and just last night, just yesterday, Safani, this guy, Safadin, who would replace Nasrallah, he was also assassinated. So he was in charge for 3 days. He didn't even make it. Now Hezbollah, I'm not even going to venture to guess who the next is going to be. There are some rumors out there, but who knows, because he might not even make it through the evening. So we'll see. But Israel has really taken it to Hezbollah. And so when I said at the very beginning, what was Hezbollah, is because at this point, they're not really operating as an entity like they used to. Israel not only conducted a decapitation event, killing the leadership and killing some of the most senior leaders, they have killed so many by the hundreds of those that have been the most experienced and the leadership structure of this entity that it can't really operate. It's almost like saying taking all the officers out of a unit and just leaving all the NCOs and the fighters. Now, you NCOs out there are going to argue that we could do it without you anyways, but you get the point. And so there's going to be pockets of fighters. There might be a unit here, a unit there that have some senior leaders that are going to be able to put up some resistance. They know where the munitions are over in this sustainment area and this location, whatever. And it's not like they're completely defunct. But from a generalized strategic organization standpoint, it's over, right? At least for the time being. And it's going to take a very, very long time for Hezbollah to get back on its feet, if you will. And it's for another discussion as to whether Israel even lets them do that, right? If Israel continues to apply so much pressure on Hezbollah that they're not able to reconstitute. One thing an additional thing that's happened over the last couple of weeks, last week in particular, is that every time a cargo plane flies in from Tehran that Israel would typically know is IRGC fighters or supplies coming in to resupply Hezbollah, Israel turns them right back around. I mean, they went right to the Lebanese government and said, listen, tell that plane to go back or we're just taking it out of the sky. And at this point, nobody is challenging Israel. I mean, they've done so much damage now and what they've done against Hamas and Hezbollah, but no one's challenging the fact that Israel's not going to take that plane out. So the plane turns right back around and goes to Tehran. So is that an indicator of what Israel is going to do going forward? Right? Is it, even when these things calm down, Israel removes itself out of Lebanon again, and Hezbollah finds itself in a place where it has to reconstitute? Is it not going to let it? Right? Every time they see the next leader, are they just going to kill it? I don't know. So they don't have to feel like they're in this position again. That who knows? I mean, we'll have to see how this thing plays out going forward. But nonetheless, that's who Hezbollah is and kind of what they were, because they're not what they used to be. So, all right, thanks for joining me here on the episode today. I hope you got a good understanding of Hezbollah and why they matter, and we'll see if they matter into the future. Next week, I've already got the episode done. We've got it recorded, so be on the lookout for the Battle of Saratoga with my friend from Dark History, Rob Bradley. And we did our recording, and it's interesting. It's pretty good. So it's not as long as an hour that we typically do, but it'll be up next week, and I hope you enjoy that. And then hopefully I'll have another conference update. I've got potentially heading off to another conference that's that should be really fun, and I'm going to run into some people I'm looking forward to meeting and hanging out with, and we'll probably do a podcast on what happened at the conference and some of the things we learned about the future of warfare and those kind of things. So look forward to that in the next couple of weeks. As always, head off to headlinesinhistory.com. You can email me at johnmollick@headlinesinhistory. Continue to put all the new episodes up on the website there. Reach out, contact me if you want to do an interview or you have some show suggestions or anything else. So John Molick at headlinesinhistory.com or headlinesinhistory.com itself. Again, thanks for joining me here today, and we will see you next week.